The Silent Strategist, How I Turned My Weakness into the Ultimate Revenge. I've always been the kind of guy who doesn't rock the boat. I keep my head down, go to work, help out at home, and do what I'm asked without complaint. I guess you could say I've always been a people pleaser, the kind of guy who avoids conflict at all costs. Maybe it's because I was raised to be polite, to never raise my voice, to always try to make others happy. But somehow, somewhere along the way, I became the pushover. At least, that's how my wife, Julia, and her family see me. They joke about it when they think I can't hear. They laugh about how I'll always give in to whatever Julia asks, even if it doesn't make sense. It's almost like they're all in on a joke that I'm the punchline to. Alex won't do anything, Julia says, as if it's a fact. He's too soft. I never thought much of it. I mean, I've always been the kind of guy who doesn't mind taking a step back if it means keeping the peace. I love Julia and I trust her. I thought her family's comments were just that, comments. They're harmless, right? After all, they're family. But lately, I've started to wonder if I've been too trusting. I don't like confrontation, but that doesn't mean I don't notice things. Like how Julia always knows exactly when to ask me for money. And how her family seems to think it's funny when I give it to her without question. Oh, he won't mind, I overheard once. He never says no. It's a joke to them. They think I'm weak. And for the most part, I've let them think that. But there was one moment, one thing I overheard that changed everything. It was one of those rare moments when I stumbled across something I shouldn't have. I didn't mean to listen in. I wasn't snooping. But as I sat there, scrolling through my phone while Julia chatted away on the other end of the room, I heard her laugh. You know, she said to her sister, Alex never even questioned me when I told him I needed $5,000 for the renovation. I just said it and he handed it over like it was nothing. My stomach dropped. I felt the blood drain from my face. That was a huge amount of money. And I'd given it to her without even blinking. Julia's sister laughed. You should take more while you can, she said. He won't do anything. That's when it hit me. Everything, the way they all talked about me, the way they dismissed me, the way they mocked my kindness as weakness, it wasn't just playful teasing. They were playing a game, and I was the fool they were all laughing at. I stayed quiet. I didn't want to believe it at first. I didn't want to confront Julia. But deep down, something told me it was time to start paying attention. The thing is, I've always been patient. I've always believed that if I just stayed calm, stayed kind, everything would work out. But now I'm starting to wonder if that patience has only made things worse. I've been too nice. And now I'm beginning to think it's time to stop being the pushover. Because the truth is, even the quiet ones have their limits. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the casual jokes anymore, the little digs Julia and her family made at my expense. No, this was something much bigger, something that had been brewing under the surface for longer than I'd realized. But I never expected it to hit me so suddenly. It was last Tuesday. Brielle was in the other room playing on her iPad, and I was sitting at the kitchen table mindlessly scrolling through the App Store to find new games for her. Julia had linked her iPad to mine for the parental controls, and as I was adding educational apps, my phone buzzed. I glanced down, expecting a work email, but instead it was a message from an unknown group chat titled Family Only. I froze. It was Julia, her sister, and her mom. I hadn't meant to open it. I wasn't the type to snoop. But something made me tap on the notification anyway. What I read next made my heart drop into my stomach. Colton is such a pushover, Julia wrote, her words casually dismissive. He didn't even bat an eye when I told him I needed $5,000 for the house renovation. He just handed it over. I felt the blood drain from my face. $5,000. I'd given it to her without asking a single question. And then there was more. You should take more while you can, Julia's sister, Lucy, replied. The laughing emoji was attached to her message. He's too nice for his own good, Julia's mom, Aurora, chimed in. Remember when he gave up that promotion because it meant more family time? I don't know why you don't just take everything from him. I scrolled up further, my stomach sinking deeper with every line. He'll never notice, Julia had written. He trusts me too much. The next few messages were worse. They were planning how to slowly drain our savings, hiding it behind so-called necessary household expenses for things that didn't exist. Fake renovations. Loans to Lucy. Emergency trips to spa weekends and shopping sprees. I felt like I was suffocating as I read through the deceit. This wasn't just a conversation, it was a carefully constructed web of lies. And I had been the one they'd been laughing at, the one they thought would never catch on. Before I go any further, I need to ask you, my amazing viewers, have you ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted? Have you ever been blind to something right under your nose only to wake up to the truth? If so, hit that like button because you're not alone. This story, it's only beginning. I tried to breathe to calm myself, but it was impossible. My hands were shaking as I opened our banking app. It was like the ground beneath me had cracked wide open. I started to connect the dots, money disappearing from joint accounts, suspicious transfers, and an alarming number of unexplained charges. Renovation planning? That was a lie. Emergency loans to Lucy? Another lie. Julia had been funneling money into a separate account, using our savings like they were her own personal piggy bank. I couldn't believe it. The woman I loved, the one I trusted with everything, had been planning this behind my back. And her family, her own mother and sister, had been in on it too. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. My heart was pounding in my chest as the reality of what I was seeing set in. How long had this been going on? How many times had I been played without even realizing it? The betrayal was so deep, so calculated, it felt like a punch to the gut. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to confront Julia right then and there to demand answers. But another part of me, something quieter, something more calculated, knew that doing so would be a mistake. No, I needed more. I needed to understand the full extent of her deceit. I needed to watch, to gather everything, to make sure I wasn't just another fool in their twisted game. And that's when I decided. I would play along. Let them keep thinking they had me figured out. Because, in the end, the quiet ones, those who observe, who take note of every little thing, are the ones who get the last laugh. The days that followed were strange. On the surface, nothing had changed. Julia and I continued to live our lives as if nothing was wrong. I went to work, came home, and kissed her hello like I always did. She smiled, asked me how my day was, and I smiled back. But underneath it all, my mind was working. Calculating. Watching. Julia seemed to think everything was fine. That I was still the same easygoing, passive husband who didn't ask questions. And for a while, I let her believe it. I played my part to perfection. When she asked for money for the house renovation, I didn't bat an eye. I handed it over, just like before. She didn't even notice the slightest change in me. I kept up the act, always polite, always accommodating. I helped Brielle with her homework, took her to the park, did everything I was expected to do. But the whole time I was collecting evidence. I began to take screenshots of Julia's messages, the ones with her family and the ones she'd sent me, some with subtle hints, others blatantly asking for more money. I'd glance at the bank statements when I could, noting the transfers that didn't make sense. I started keeping a detailed record of every conversation, every transaction, and every phone call I overheard. The receipts, the sudden withdrawals, the unexplained charges, everything was adding up. In the evenings, when Julia was busy texting her family or working late, I would sit quietly at my desk. I wasn't looking for confrontation. I wasn't looking for an argument. I was simply building my case. Piece by piece, I was gathering the puzzle pieces that would eventually show the full picture. I didn't let my suspicions show. If anything, I became more attentive. I started to notice the little things, the way Julia always seemed to forget to mention her financial dealings until after the fact, the way she was constantly on her phone whenever I wasn't looking. I wasn't angry, at least not yet. I was calm, collected. I knew that the time to act would come, but it wasn't yet. It wasn't time for drama. It wasn't time for accusations. It was time for strategy. Every time Julia would talk about her business venture or ask for money for another urgent expense, I simply nodded. She thought I was naive. She thought I was the same pushover I'd always been. But she had no idea that I was already ahead of her. I wasn't just playing the role of the fool, I was becoming one step closer to the truth. One evening, I overheard her talking to her mother in the other room. The usual conversation about how much money I'll never miss was taking place. I stayed quiet, sitting in the living room pretending to watch TV. But inside, I was alert, taking mental notes. Every word, every laugh, every joke, they made at my expense, everything. Julia walked back into the living room and I greeted her with a smile as though nothing had changed. She was oblivious. She had no idea that I had already begun to piece together everything. No idea that the very trust she was exploiting had now become the foundation for her undoing. The shift in me wasn't dramatic. There were no explosive outbursts. No yelling. No confrontations. It was quiet. It was subtle. It was calculated. And that, I realized, was the most dangerous part of all. I had spent my whole life being patient, avoiding conflict. But now I was using that same patience as a weapon. I wasn't the pushover they thought I was. I was the observer. The one who watched. The one who knew exactly when to make my move. The waiting was the hardest part. Every day I played my part and every night I gathered more evidence. I knew that eventually the moment would come. But for now I was the calm before the storm. And when the storm hit, it would be devastating. The day of the family dinner arrived and the atmosphere felt charged with an energy I couldn't ignore. Julia was busy getting ready, fussing over every detail as she always did when we had company. She seemed carefree as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But I knew better. Today was the day everything would change. As we drove to her mother's house, I could feel the familiar tension in the air. The laughter, the casual chatter, the little jokes, all of it felt like a mask for the storm that was about to hit. Julia didn't suspect a thing. In fact, she was more affectionate than usual, chatting away about the latest business venture she was supposedly planning. She thought I was on her side, oblivious to the truth, but she couldn't have been more wrong. We arrived at the dinner, and I smiled as I walked through the door. I greeted everyone politely, just like I always did, nodding along to the conversation as if nothing had changed. Julia's family was there, her sister, Lucy, always ready with a sarcastic remark, her mother, Aurora, never missing a chance to subtly mock me. They were all so comfortable in their little game. They thought I was the fool, the passive husband who would never stand up to them. But tonight, they were about to learn how wrong they were. I didn't make a scene. I didn't shout, I didn't cry. I simply walked in, calmly, collected, with 6 manila envelopes in hand. Each envelope was marked with a name, one for each of them. The room fell silent as I placed them on the table. Julia raised an eyebrow, glancing at me curiously. "What's this?" she asked, a slight edge to her voice. "Before we discuss any business ventures," I said, my voice steady and calm, "I thought everyone might want to take a look at these." I watched as her face went pale when she saw the manila envelopes. The tension in the room thickened as everyone reached for their envelope, glancing at me, then back at the papers inside. Their eyes flicked from the bank statements to the receipts, the screenshots from the group chat, and the photographs of Julia with her lover, each one time-stamped and clear. I stayed silent as they opened the documents. The damning evidence was right there in black and white. "Colton, I can explain," Julia began, her voice trembling. "Explain." I cut her off, my voice cold. "Explain the $47,000 you've been siphoning from our savings? Or the credit cards I didn't know we had? Or perhaps you'd like to explain this." I slid a photo of Julia with her lover across the table, his hand on her waist, clearly taken during one of their secret rendezvous. Her face drained of color. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. "I think you should start explaining," I said, my tone still calm, but with an unmistakable authority now. Lucy, who had been sitting there smirking earlier, suddenly looked uncomfortable. "This is a misunderstanding, right? There's got to be some mistake," she stammered, but there was no conviction in her voice. I turned to her. "A mistake? You were the one who encouraged Julia to keep taking more. You were the one laughing in that group chat about how I'd never notice." I pointed to the screen of my phone, showing them the messages they thought I hadn't seen. Aurora, sitting across from me, suddenly stood up, her face flushed with anger. "You have no right to invade our privacy like this," she shouted, her voice trembling with fury. "Right?" I repeated, my gaze never leaving hers. "I think the real question is, how did you think you'd get away with this? You've been stealing from me, from my daughter. And you didn't think I'd notice?" The room was silent now, except for the sound of Julia's shaky breath. Her face had twisted from disbelief to panic. You don't understand," she whispered, her eyes darting between her mother and sister. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence linger for a moment. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to scream. I had the evidence. And that was all that mattered. "You underestimated me," I said softly, my gaze fixed on Julia. "You thought I was weak. You thought I'd never stand up for myself. But I was watching, Julia. I was always watching." The panic in her eyes grew. She stood up, knocking her chair over in the process, her hands trembling. "I can fix this. Just let me explain." But there was no explanation left to be had. The walls had come down. The game was over. As Julia began to realize that there was no way out, I watched her family turn on her. Lucy's eyes widened as she took in the full scope of the evidence, and Aurora's anger turned to guilt. The family that had been so quick to mock me, so sure I was just a pushover, now saw me for what I truly was, a man who had been quietly biding his time, watching and waiting for the right moment to take control. The storm had arrived. And I hadn't raised my voice once. I hadn't needed to. I had simply let them think they were winning until they weren't. The days after the confrontation were a blur of paperwork, lawyers, and phone calls. The dust was settling, but the weight of everything that had happened still lingered in the back of my mind. The betrayal, the lies, the years of trust that had been shattered, it all felt surreal. It was as if the life I'd been living had been a dream, and now I was awake, faced with the reality of what had transpired. Julia had tried to explain herself in the hours following the dinner, but I wasn't interested in her excuses. She was facing criminal charges for fraud, and her family was scattered. Lucy, desperate to save herself, had started to spill every secret she knew about Julia and Aurora. She was already cooperating with authorities, offering to testify about the years of manipulation, all in exchange for leniency. Aurora, on the other hand, had tried to play the victim card, claiming she was just a mother supporting her daughters, but the evidence had already spoken for itself. The emails, the messages, the receipts, it was all too much. The walls they had so carefully built around themselves had crumbled, and now they were left to pick up the pieces of their ruined lives. As for me, I was focused on moving forward. I'd filed for divorce, and the custody battle was already underway. I wasn't fighting for revenge, I was fighting for my daughter, Lily. I was fighting to create a life for her where she didn't have to watch the same betrayal play out over and over again. And I would make sure that Julia never had the opportunity to use her as a pawn again. In the weeks that followed, I watched as Julia's world unraveled. Her friends turned their backs on her when they found out about the affair and the financial fraud. The business she'd been building collapsed, and the reputation she had spent years crafting was destroyed in a matter of days. She wasn't the woman I had married anymore. She was a stranger, someone who had lost everything in her pursuit of power. I could have taken pleasure in her downfall. I could have reveled in the sweet satisfaction of knowing that she was getting exactly what she deserved. But the truth is, I wasn't interested in that. What mattered was that I had taken control of my own life. The quiet patience I had once thought was my weakness had become my greatest strength. And then, one day, I realized how much I had changed. I stood in front of the mirror looking at the man who had been so easily dismissed by those around him. I was no longer that man. I wasn't the pushover who had let people walk all over him. I was stronger, smarter, and more determined than I had ever been. I had learned the hard way that sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes silence is strength. And patience? Patience is a weapon. I thought about Lily as I stood there, reflecting on everything that had happened. She was thriving now, enrolled in a new school, making friends, and slowly healing from the chaos of the past few months. I was proud of her strength, proud of how she had handled everything. She had witnessed the collapse of the world she once knew, but now she was building something new, a life that was free from the toxicity that had once surrounded us. As for Julia, she had been left to pick up the pieces of her own shattered existence. Her life had become a never-ending cycle of regret and disappointment, and as I watched from a distance, I couldn't help but feel a sense of irony. She had underestimated me. They had all underestimated me. The quiet, patient man who had been the butt of their jokes, the one they thought would never fight back, he was the one who had walked away victorious. I had kept my calm, my strategy, and in the end, that was what had won me everything that truly mattered, my daughter, my peace, and my dignity. The world had crumbled around Julia and her family, but I was standing tall, watching it all fall apart from the sidelines. Sometimes the greatest victory comes not in the loudest actions, but in the quiet ones. The ones that take patience, time, and strategy. And that's how I won. It's funny, really. They thought I was the pushover. But in the end, I was the one who had the last laugh.